begins videotape number 1 in the deposition of Deborah Wiegand in the matter of Kevin Tolson versus St. Agnes Healthcare, Inc. et al. in the Circuit Court for Baltimore City, Maryland. Case number 24C12008071. Today's date is March 4th, 2014, and the time on the video is 12:46 p.m. This video deposition is taking place at 901 Delaney Valley Road, Towson, Maryland. My name is Paul Cannon, and I am the videographer. The court reporter is Carrie Inkenbrandt, and we are with Merrill Reporting. Will the attorneys please identify themselves and whom they represent?
Rodney M. Gaston, and I represent the plaintiff, Kevin Tolson.
Mary Pat McGuire, I represent the defendants, St. Agnes Healthcare, Inc., and Caroline Stell, RN.
The court reporter will now swear in the witness.
Raise your right hand, please. In the testimony you're about to give, do you solemnly swear or affirm, under the penalties of perjury, to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do.
Ma'am, could you please state your name and business address?
Deborah Wiegand. Address is 655 West Lombard Street, Suite 404P, Baltimore, Maryland, 21201.
Ms. Wiegand, my name is Rodney Gaston, and I represent Kevin Tolson in the matter that's currently pending in the Circuit Court for Baltimore City. The reason I've asked you here today to take your discovery deposition is because St. Agnes Hospital and Caroline Stell has identified you as an expert witness in this case. The main purpose of the deposition is for me to find out all the opinions that you intend to give in this case and all the factual basis for your opinions. Have you had your deposition taken before?
I have.
Okay. I'll just go over a couple of ground rules. If at any time I ask a question that you don't understand, just stop me, and I'll try to rephrase the question. Otherwise, if you don't, we'll assume that you've understood my question and that you've answered it accordingly. Also, if at any time you need to take a break, just let us know and we'll stop the deposition. All right. Ma'am, I'm going to show you what's been marked as exhibit number 1.
Okay.
And this is the notice of your deposition today. And attached to that notice is a list of documents that we requested that you bring today to your deposition. And I noticed that you have brought a lot of materials here today that we have already marked. Other than the materials that we have already marked, have you brought any other items that I requested you to bring with you that's listed in exhibit number 1?
I know everything that I brought. You have seen.
Okay. All right. And can we go over what we've already marked? And if you could simply identify that on the records so that we know what the exhibits pertain to. And you can just go over one by one and just
Sure.
read the exhibit number off. And if you could tell me what that pertains to.
Okay, so Exhibit 22
Yes,
is
ma'am.
just a few notes I have on the case.
Okay.
Exhibit 5 are the medical records of Mr. Tolson.
And can you tell me what dates the medical records pertain to from what visits?
I have the medical records here for St. Agnes 12309 ER visit, the Concerta Medical Center 12509 visit, and the St. Agnes 12509 ER visit and admission. I don't have the University of Maryland records, and I did not look at those.
Thank you. Ma'am, in exhibit number 5, there is a sleeve on the inside left portion
Yes.
of the booklet. Can you tell me what's contained in there?
Sure. So it's the discharge summary, I think that's what this is, from Concerta. The clear version of the Maryland Ambulance Information System records. And patient discharge information from St. Agnes that includes a handout on sprains and when to call the doctor, and a summary of the patient visit information from St. Agnes dated 12/3/09.
Actually,
I'm sorry.
just to clarify the record, that's actually the two-page written discharge instructions that were given to Mr. Tilson from the St. Agnes ED.
Thank
That
you.
you're holding up.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Ma'am, for the document that you identified as to, it looks like there's printed, right there, yes ma'am.
Oh, I'm sorry.
And these are printed instructions from St. Agnes. What ailments or illnesses do those printed instructions pertain to?
And again, if you would allow me to clarify the record, that document that the witness is currently holding up is the educational materials referenced in the medical record that were given to Mr. Tolson at discharge.
Yes.
Okay, and what do they pertain to? If you could just read the title.
The title is sprains.
Sprains. And did you receive the sprain material at the same time you received the medical records for Mr. Tolson's 12309 admission, or did you receive those at a later time?
To be honest with you, I don't recall.
Okay. And do you know who told you that those were the materials that were given to Mr. Tolson if they weren't contained in the original chart? Do you have any idea?
Objection to the statement if they weren't included in the original chart.
I don't recall.
Okay. And when I looked through the original medical chart, I didn't see the material entitled sprains in the chart. Did you see those in the chart either?
I don't believe it was part of this chart. And the holes aren't punched in it, so I think it must have come perhaps with some other mailing that came to me.
I apologize.
No problem.
I
Actually,
object to everything that I asked for.
I took up all your space. Hold on, let me just move this.
Sorry,
It's okay.
couldn't get out of Baltimore County Courthouse.
12:53 PM, going off the record. 12:53 PM, back on the record.
Okay, ma'am. Is there anything else that was contained in the sleeve in exhibit number 5 that we haven't talked about?
I don't believe so, no.
Okay, and if you can continue on with the rest
Sure.
of your materials that have been marked as exhibits, please.
Okay, Exhibit 21. Do you want me to go through each document? Oh, I'm sorry. These
Because-
are each separate, yes.
Because exhibit number 121 is a collection of materials, if you
Correct.
can simply identify what's contained in that exhibit for us.
Sure. So Exhibit 4 is an affidavit for Linda Margison.
And so we don't confuse which exhibits we're talking about. This is a paper that's has been stamped as another exhibit number within exhibit 21?
Yes.
Okay, go ahead.
Yes, and I believe, I don't know. Let's go to the title. Yes, that's the affidavit. Okay, so Exhibit 5 is an expert report for Linda Margison. Exhibit 1 is a certificate of qualified expert for Linda Margison. And does this one have a number anywhere?
I don't think so. If you could just, would
Sure.
that be the complaint?
Yes.
Okay, go ahead.
Okay. And then there's some notes from Linda Margison, Exhibit 11. I think these were her notes. And then Exhibit 10 is Linda Margison's CV. Exhibit 3 is Kevin Tolson's affidavit. Exhibit, I don't see anything on this one. Does this one need, I don't see.
Just read the top with the
Sure,
title is.
it's Certificate of Qualified Expert for Jeffrey Nicholson.
Thank you, ma'am.
Sure. And this says Exhibit 1, Certificate of Qualified Expert for Kenneth Larson. And then I think there's just some notes that were part of Margison's deposition. Thank you.
Are those pages from the ESI journal?
I think so. She had a huge amount of things I didn't print.
Thank you,
I
ma'am.
just printed those too. So in this folder, I have Exhibit 14, which is this transcript of Corey Elaine Tolson. Exhibit 12, I believe, is the transcript of Marion Tolson. Exhibit 13 is the transcript of Kevin Philip Tolson Sr. Exhibit 15 is the transcript of Robin Laverne Reinhardt. And I don't see an exhibit on this, but this is Stacy Ametta Tolson's deposition.
Okay, we'll take just about a 10-second break, and I'd ask the court reporter to please mark this as our next exhibit, please. Ma'am, what sticker number is
Thank you. So that's Exhibit 23 for Stacy Ametta Tolson.
Thank you.
Sure. All right, then Exhibit 16 is the deposition of Sharon Craddock, RN. Exhibit 17 is the transcript for Anita Weiss, RN. Exhibit 18 is the transcript for Caroline Stahl, RN. Exhibit 19 is the, I keep mixing up the words here, but transcript for Krepa Shah, PA. And Exhibit 20 is the transcript for Prudence Jackson, MD. All right, then my last pile are the experts. And Exhibit 10 is the transcript of Paul Collier, MD. Let's set this aside there. Exhibit 9 is a transcript for Jeffrey Nicholson, PA. Exhibit 8 is the transcript for Meridad Mike Malik, MD. Exhibit 7 is the transcript for James Black, vascular surgeon, MD. And then I have 2 volumes for Linda Margison. The second volume is labeled Exhibit 11.
11, did you say?
11. Does the first one go with this, or is it separate?
We're going to mark this one as our next exhibit. Take a 10-second break.
So, for the record.
Did I say it wrong?
Sorry. No, you're right.
So this is the other volume. So this is Exhibit 24 for Linda Margison, first volume. And then I don't believe there's a sticker on this one.
All right, we'll take
Dr.
another
Larson.
10-second break. We'll ask the court reporter to mark this exhibit.
Okay, so the last transcript is Dr. Larson, and it is Exhibit 25. That's everything.
And can you tell me when you were initially contacted by the defense attorney to serve as an expert witness in this case?
I believe it was last winter, last April, according to this. April 26th.
Did we talk about that exhibit yet?
Exhibit 6, correspondence.
Number 6 is the correspondence. Okay,
Sorry.
thank you. And what was the date, ma'am, that you were contacted by defense counsel?
April 26th, 2013.
And can you tell me if you have a recollection of when you rendered your opinions in this case?
I don't know if I might have done some brief review after I reviewed this last spring, but then I didn't see any of the depositions until much later. So I may have given an initial opinion based on the medical record review last spring of 2013, but I can't tell you exactly when.
Okay. Has your opinions changed in any way after you reviewed? I know there's a lot of depositions in this
Right,
case, but
right.
did your opinions change in any way after you reviewed any of the deposition testimony?
No.
Okay. Are you relying upon any of the deposition testimony for the opinions that you're going to give in this case?
Yes.
Okay. Which depositions, and we're going to have to go over these. Let's talk about the experts first. Are you going to be relying upon any of the expert deposition testimony for the opinions that you're going to give in this case?
Well, if I may, I am certainly going to ask Ms. Wiegand to respond to the deposition testimony by Dr. Larson and Nurse Margison to the extent they have testified with respect to the nurses at St. Agnes.
Okay, let's see if we can separate the question into two questions. We'll separate the question into experts that expert testimony that you are relying upon for the opinions that you're going to give regarding the breaches of standard of care, separate from any criticisms you might have of experts in the case.
Okay, then I'm also going to object because I'm sure that there's no reliance upon the depositions of your experts for her opinions. Whether or not she agrees or disagrees is a separate issue.
But I need to hear her say that, not you.
All right.
So-
Do you understand what he's asking you?
I believe so. So in response to my opinions, I read the medical records, and then I read the family depositions for Mr. Tolson and his family. I don't know if you want me to go over everyone.
What we'll do is, if you come to, we can either do this collectively or individually, whatever's more comfortable for you. Because what I'm trying to figure out is, from the deposition testimony you've read, if there's anything in the deposition testimony that you believe you are relying upon for the opinions that you're going to give, I need to know which of those deposition testimonies you're relying upon and what part of the deposition. For example, witness A said this and this and this, and I'm relying upon that testimony for the opinions that I'm going to give.
Okay, I have to object. That is an impossible task for this witness. She is trying to tell you all the material that she reviewed, that she relied upon for her testimony. We have already gone over the number of depositions in this case, which are at least 10, probably more. To the extent that this is your discovery deposition, Rodney, you are certainly able to ask Ms. Wiegand for her opinions in the case and then ask her for the basis of those opinions. And to the extent that some of the deposition testimony supports or she used as part of her opinion or she took into account for purposes of her opinion, you can ask her those questions and I will certainly tell her that she can answer those questions. But to make her now, at the beginning of a deposition, figure out the specific sentences out of 10 to 15 expert witness depositions in addition to all the family member and Mr. Tolson's deposition by line or specific testimony is unfair. It's grossly unfair.
It's not unfair at all. Ma'am, why don't you pull out the family depositions that you have?
Mm-hmm.
And when I briefly look through those depositions, I note that you have made a lot of underlines in a lot of the depositions, and you've made a lot of some notes on some of the pages of the depositions. And we can go through each deposition one by one, and I'm trying to find out if you were relying upon any of the testimony in support of the opinions that you're going to give in this case. Because that's what I need to know now. So why don't we go through the first deposition you have there. Is that Kevin Tolson's deposition?
Yes.
Okay. Is there anything that Kevin Tolson said during his deposition that you've relied upon for the opinions that you're going to give in this case?
Objection, overly broad, impossible to answer, but to the extent that you can answer him generally.
It's not impossible. I just need to know if you're relying upon any part of his testimony for the opinions you're about to give.
He talked about his perceptions of the accident and then how he felt, how his leg felt after the accident. There's some lack of clarity, I think, within his testimony. And I'm not sure if he's confusing maybe a little bit of some of his visits, but I think it was very helpful to hear his perspective.
Well, is there anything specific about what he said that you're using to support any of your opinions?
Objection, you can ask those questions specifically in relation to specific opinions.
You can answer, ma'am.
He talked about the pain in his leg, and he talked about some feelings of tingling and numbness.
Okay, with respect to the pain in his leg and the feelings of tingling and numbness, how did you use that in support of, if you did, your opinions that you were going to give?
Objection, go ahead.
Well, I think there was just a little bit of a lack of clarity between some of his statement and some of what we saw in the medical records, some of his subjective experiences, and then some of the objective findings that are in the medical records.
Okay, you're going to have to explain a little bit more when you talk about subjective experiences and findings in the medical records.
Well-
Objection. Can I have a continuing objection to the whole part of this testimony, to the effect that you are not asking specific questions?
You can object to the lack of specificity of my question, and you can have a continuing objection in that regard if you'd like.
I'm objecting to the form of your questions, the lack of specificity in your question, and the lack of foundation to your question, which I think makes these questions unfair and essentially impossible for this witness to fully answer. That's the objection I want on the record for all of these questions.
Well, you have your objection, but to the extent that any of this can be cured by a specific objection for each question, you're going to have to do that specifically, not an overly
That's all right.
broad
I'll
objection
object
like
every
that.
question then.
Okay, go ahead.
I,
Go ahead.
he mentioned nobody took his vital signs. He mentioned he didn't get any pain medication.
Mentioned he testified he did not get any pain medication.
Oh, he did say he got something and it was supposed to work, but it didn't work.
Okay, that's what I thought.
Thank you, sorry.
All right. And how did his testimony that no one took his vital signs impact on any of the opinions that you reached in this case?
Objection to form, foundation, breadth, specificity, and the impossibility to give a complete answer, which you can answer.
Go ahead, ma'am.
I just think it led to a little bit more confusion because there were vital signs recorded. And,
More confusion. I'm just trying to
just
figure
a
out
little
how
bit of a lack of clarity.
a lack of clarity, and how did his lack of clarity affect the opinions that you reached in the case, if it did at all?
Objection, form, foundation, breadth. Same objections as before.
I'm not sure I can answer specifically. Because some things that he said, I actually think he was confusing his visits. Just made it a little difficult to follow, I think.
Is your opinion that the nurses didn't breach the standard of care in this case?
Correct.
Based upon his lack of clarity during his deposition testimony?
No, my opinion is based on reading everything. It's not just reading one piece from one deposition.
Okay, then we have to be a little specific. I want to know if your opinions that the nurses, in this case, didn't breach the standard of care based upon his lack of clarity that you concluded was present during his deposition testimony.
I'm sorry, could you repeat that?
Right. I presume you're going to render opinions that the nurses did not breach the standard of care in this case. Would that be true?
True.
Okay. In reaching those opinions, did you rely upon what you believe is a lack of clarity that you found in Mr. Tolson's deposition testimony?
Objection. Same objections as before.
Right, not specifically just that one thing, no.
Okay, but I need to know if that was included, if you included that
Objection.
in support of your opinions.
Asked and answered.
Same objections as before.
Go ahead.
Some of his opinions, or some of the things that he said, were not congruent with the medical record. So
Okay.
it made it a little bit unclear to follow.
Okay. So what he testified to differed from, some of the things he testified to was different from what's in the chart.
Correct.
Now, and how did you resolve that conflict in reaching the opinions that you have in this case?
No, I had to take everything into consideration.
Okay. For the circumstances where Mr. Tolson's recollection of what he said happened to him at the ER was different from what in the chart, did you go with what was in the chart?
No, not necessarily. I took it all under consideration.
Okay.
His deposition as well as the medical record.
Okay. If what he says is different than the chart and they're exact opposites, what I'm trying to figure out is how did you resolve that conflict?
Objection asked and answered. You can answer it again.
Yeah, I couldn't with just one deposition. I had to really look at everything. So I didn't really weigh one higher than the other. I mean, I had to take everything into consideration, and not just his deposition, but a lot of the other depositions as well.
In reaching your opinions, did you conclude that the chart was more accurate than his deposition testimony?
Not
Objection.
necessarily, no.
Okay. When he says he had a cold foot
Mm-hmm.
and reported the cold foot to the nurses, and the chart doesn't indicate that the nurse wrote that down, how did you resolve that conflict?
Objection. Foundation. And also to form, because I don't think you have time frame on that question. Go ahead.
So if he had a cold foot, well, he did say that he had a cold foot. There's no documentation from an objective perspective from the medical record that that foot was cold. So he may, as he said in his deposition, have felt that he had a cold foot, but there were several providers that documented in the medical record that there was no evidence of a cold foot. So he may have perceived coolness to the foot, or he may have even touched his foot and felt that it was cold. But when the providers then assessed his foot and compared the 2 feet, there was no difference in temperature and there was no documentation of anything being cold.
Did you then rely upon the provider's testimony in the medical chart to conclude that Mr. Tolson's foot was not cold to the touch while he was in the emergency room at St. Agnes Hospital?
Objection to form. And foundation.
There was no evidence in the medical record that the foot was cold.
Did you then rely upon the chart and the doctor's testimony to reach a conclusion that his foot was not cold?
Objection.
Well, I took everything into consideration. An individual can perceive that his or her foot is cold, but when you objectively assess the foot and compare it to the other foot, there's not a significant difference between the 2 feet.
In reaching your opinions that the providers, the nurses, did not breach the standard of care, did you come to the conclusion that Mr. Tolson's foot was not cold while he was in the emergency room in St. Agnes Hospital?
According to the documentation, there's no evidence that it was cold.
Did you come to the conclusion yourself that his foot was not cold while he was in the emergency room at St. Agnes
From an
Hospital?
objective perspective, from the people that assessed him, and multiple people, there's no evidence. So that would lead me to believe that that foot was not cold.
And when you came to the conclusion that his foot was not cold, did you use that conclusion in reaching your opinions that the nurses did not breach the standard of care in this case?
Objection.
That was just one piece.
But was that part of your opinion?
The objective information?
No. Let's go back.
Okay.
I think we've established that after reading the chart, Mr. Tolson's deposition testimony, and the testimony from the providers, that you've concluded that his foot was not cold while he was in the emergency room at St. Agnes Hospital, correct?
Misstates her testimony.
No.
She said objectively, based on the chart and the examinations, it was her finding that the foot was not cold, objectively. That's what she testified.
I'm going to ask a question again. I think we've determined that you've concluded yourself, as an expert in this case, from reading Mr. Tolson's deposition testimony, the chart, and the testimony of the providers, that you've concluded that his foot was not cold while he was in the emergency room at St. Agnes Hospital. Would that be true?
Same objections.
According to the objective evidence, there is no evidence that that foot was cold.
Is that true?
That's true.
That you've concluded yourself that his foot was not cold?
Just asked and answered. You've answered
she-
it three
no,
times. You do
no,
not need to answer
ma'am.
that question again.
No, ma'am. When you concluded in your own mind that his foot was not cold while he was in St. Agnes Hospital, did you use that conclusion in support of the opinions that you're going to give that the nurses did not breach the standard of care?
Objection to the form and foundation. You just misrepresented her last two previous answers as the predicate to that question.
You can answer.
Well, that was just a piece of the information.
So
When you're
that,
asking me a specific question about his foot being cold, there's no evidence that that foot was cold. So that's a piece of the assessment of his foot and his leg.
and that's the piece of information, one of the pieces that you used to reach your opinions that the nurses did not breach the standard of care in this case. Would that be true?
Objection to form and foundation.
It reinforces what was assessed by the nurse, and was there any evidence of problem, specifically regarding the coolness of the foot. I mean, that cold isn't the whole picture in this case.
But it's part of the picture that you relied upon in reaching your opinions that the nurses did not breach the standard of care. Would that be true?
Objection asked and answered.
I mean, I can keep saying the same thing, but
Well,
I mean,
I'm not understanding your answer. Here's what I'm trying to figure out, ma'am. One part of this case is whether or not Mr. Tolson's foot was cold when he was in the hospital. Would you agree that that's one part of this case?
there's a discrepancy between what he did say and what the, which would be subjective, and what the objective findings were.
Okay. Now,
Yes.
Okay, now, in order for you to reach your opinions in this case, that's one part that you had to resolve for yourself in your own mind. Please don't shake your head when I'm answering the questions, because you're telegraphing the witness what to say. That's completely inappropriate. So please don't do that again.
Well, I
Now-
will try very hard not to
No.
do that, Rodney. If
But
you
you're
would
doing
stop
it, and it's
purposefully
inappropriate.
misstating the
It's
witness's
not-
testimony
I'm not.
as the predicate to your question. Yes, you are. Either that or you're just not listening to our answers, and I don't know which it is. But whichever it is, I need you to be fair in your questions.
I'm fair. Ma'am, let me go back again. We've already agreed that one part of this case is whether or not Mr. Tolson's foot was cold at the emergency room. Would you agree with that?
Correct.
Now, in order for you to reach your opinions that the nurses did not breach the standard of care, would it be fair to say that you evaluated that part of this case,
Which part?
the cold foot part?
Oh, that was a piece of the puzzle, yes.
Okay. And in evaluating that, you reached a conclusion in your own mind that his foot was not cold.
Correct.
Okay,
Objection.
got it. Fine. Now,
According to objective findings.
right. I understand. Now, if it turns out that his foot was cold in the emergency room, assume that's a fact, that it was cold, and there were objective findings of this,
So somebody assessed it and somebody thought it was.
yes, would your
touched
opinion
and was
change?
Objection. There's absolutely no foundation for that question.
There is, and please don't say there's not. Did you read the testimony of Corey Elaine Tolson?
Yes, I did.
And she actually felt Mr. Tolson's foot,
She did say that, yes.
and she felt that the foot was cold to the touch,
She
correct?
did state that, yes.
Did you believe that that is objective evidence of a, let me finish the question.
Mhm.
Objective evidence of his foot being cold when someone else felt it and then exclaimed, your foot's cold to the touch?
All right, so Corey Elaine did say that in her deposition, that she touched his foot. I think she prayed over his foot, and she felt that the foot was cold. She didn't, she's not a professional, so there's no evidence that she compared both extremities. And you really can't do a thorough assessment and say that a foot is cold without comparing it to the other extremity, because both feet may be equally cold. And that's just like a key thing. We don't touch one leg without touching the other leg. So yes, she did say that. The foot was cold to touch, or cold to touch, but I don't see any evidence that she compared it to his other foot.
So is it your opinion that her feeling Mr. Tolson's foot touching the foot, feeling that it was cold to the touch, was not objective evidence of his foot being cold to the touch in your evaluation of the case.
It can't,
Objection. Go ahead.
it can't be taken as a single find. You have to compare it to the other extremity.
So you concluded that her testimony that his foot was cold to the touch was not objective evidence of the foot being cold to the touch because she didn't compare it with the other
It
foot.
was not enough
Objective and-
information.
I'm sorry.
Sorry.
Objection. Asked and answered. You can answer it
was-
one more time, and then we can move on.
Sure. It was not enough evidence. It was not enough. It was just looking at one extremity, and it just doesn't give you enough information.
Okay. So in order for her complaint or evaluation to be valid, in your mind as an expert, she would have had to have touched his other foot and then note a difference between the temperatures of the two foot at that time?
Objection to the use of the term valid, objection to the fact that you are misstating her testimony again, and the fact that she's now answered this 4 times. You do not need to answer this question anymore.
Okay. I will
Ma'am,
not.
what other information would you need to know from Ms. Tolson's touching Mr. Tolson's foot to find that her conclusion was valid?
Objection to the term valid. I don't think that that's a fair phrasing of a question to an expert in this instance. Please restate your question.
No, ma'am, do you know what the word valid means when I'm using it?
Not really.
Do you know what the word objective means?
I do.
Okay, now, what other objective information would you have needed from Ms. Corey Tolson's touching Mr. Tolson's body and foot while he was in the emergency room to believe that her conclusion that his foot was cold to the touch was an objective conclusion?
Objection. The question makes no sense, and it misstates all her testimony again.
It does not.
It
Ma'am,
does.
Do you understand the question I've asked you?
I think you keep asking me the same thing.
Okay.
I don't expect a family to really make a really objective assessment or evaluation of a family member's extremities. There's some training involved, there's some education involved, and there's just like a systematic approach that we use. You don't just touch a foot. You know, there's a way that we do it. You know, there's a way we start at the top, there's a way we come down. I mean, there's just a way that we do it that I personally wouldn't expect a family to do that, any family. So I don't disbelieve what she said. I think she touched the foot felt cool to her. I certainly believe what she said. I just don't think the comparison with the other extremities and the knowledge was there to really make that an expert opinion on from a family. It's input, and it's important input, but it's not, it doesn't help a lot in this case, personally, to tell you the truth.
It didn't assist you in reaching any opinions that you have in this case.
Objection.
Would that be fair?
She just testified that she took it into account and that she's not saying it's not true, that that's how it felt to her.
I'm asking you if her testimony about his foot being cold to the touch assisted you in reaching the opinions that you reached in this case or
It
not.
helped me to think actually more carefully about everything because there was some consistency in the family's concern and Mr. Tolson's concern about his foot. So I just kind of kept looking for consistency and looking at the assessment to see if anything was really then found in the documentation, you know, to really show that this was, you know, a problem.
Let me ask you this. From any of the testimony of the providers, did anyone actually assess Mr. Tolson's foot after Elaine Tolson touched Mr. Tolson's foot and felt that it was cold to the touch?
Yes.
Okay. Who reassessed his foot after Elaine Tolson testified that his foot was cold to the touch?
Well, there's some documentation. I don't know exact timing of when she said she did that and everything, but there's evidence in the medical record that the foot was assessed on triage, that the foot was assessed then when the patient was back in the urgent care area by the nurse, Stell. There's evidence that the foot was assessed by the PA Shaw in the urgent care setting, and then the foot was assessed again by Shaw after the splint was applied, and the foot was assessed again, according to deposition, by the nurse on discharge.
What I'm trying to figure out is, were you able to determine from any of the testimony of the providers that they actually reassessed his foot after the family member, his sister, found his foot to be cold to the touch?
Sister being Corey
Elaine
Elaine, based on
Tolson.
her deposition testimony?
Well, so your question is specifically about the deposition. I think my answer to that, part of my answer to that would be when Corey Elaine said that she felt that his foot was cool to touch. Mr. Tolson was there, his sister was there, his mom was there in the room. According to Corey Elaine's deposition, she said that she told the nurse that foot was cool to touch. And then the nurse in that deposition, that same deposition, said, I'll go tell the doctor. And then the nurse left the room, and according to Corey Elaine's deposition again, it sounds like the doctor or somebody came into the room then. And Corey Elaine left the room, but I think it was Mr. Tolson's mom who then said that that person who came into the room, it may have been the physician assistant, it may have been the physician, then looked at and evaluated that leg.
And do you know the description that they used for this person that came into the room?
I'd have to look specifically, but I think it may have fit the description of the physician assistant.
I thought it was a male.
I'd have to look specifically if you want me to.
Okay. Well, then my
I think
question...
there was a male involved somewhere in the discharge, but not,
Okay.
as I recall,
So
earlier.
if I understand the sequence of events as you understand them, Corey Elaine...
No, as from the testimony of the family member is the predicate of that question.
If I understand the sequence of events as you understand them in this case, with respect to the timing that Ms. Corey Elaine touched Mr. Tolson's foot and said it was cold, that a nurse had came into the room, and while the nurse was there, Mr. Tolson informed the nurse that his foot was cold and also that he had no feeling in his foot. And then the nurse said, I'll tell the doctor.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, now, did the standard of care require the nurse to convey those complaints to Mr. Tolson's doctor?
The standard,
Objection, go ahead.
the standard of care would be that if that information was given to the nurse, in this case she, would tell the physician or his or her designee, the physician assistant.
Okay, and if that nurse failed to tell the doctor or the physician's assistant of that complaint, would that be a breach of the standard of care?
Objection to the lack of foundation
It's
to
a
the
hypothetical, but there's more reason than not to believe that she did, because when that information was given to the nurse, according to Corey Elaine's testimony or deposition, she left the room, the nurse left the room, and then somebody came in to assess, which
Well,
looks like perhaps it was a physician assistant. So you would lead it to believe more than not that that information was translated and someone came in.
But my question is,
Okay.
if the information that Mr. Tolston, in accordance with his deposition testimony, told the nurse that his foot was cold to the touch and he had no feeling, if that nurse did not convey that to either the physician's assistant or the doctor, would that have been a breach of the standard of nursing care?
Objection to the lack of fact in the hypothetical. It's an incomplete hypothetical. You can answer the question again.
It would be expected that that information would be communicated.
And if it was not, would that be a breach of the standard of nursing care in this case?
Again, absent the complete hypothetical, using
Right,
all the
given the
testimony.
hypothetical situation, and given that the nurse did not communicate the information, that would be a breach.
Okay. Now, so, and I presume that you concluded that the nurse did in fact relate to either the physician's assistant or the doctor that Mr. Tolson's foot was cold to the touch, and either the physician or the doctor then came back into his room and reassessed his foot. Do I have that correct?
I'm sorry, can you repeat that?
Sure. Are you assuming in this case, from,
Based on the testimony of Corey Elaine.
based upon the testimony and anything else, that after the nurse who told Mr. Tolson she would tell the doctor left the room, that either a physician assistant or a doctor came back into his room and actually reassessed his foot?
Based on her deposition, yes.
Okay. And are you assuming that for the opinion that the nurse did not breach the standard of care but had complied with the standard of care by relaying his complaint to either the physician assistant or Mr. Tolson's doctor.
Based on
Objection.
this testimony. There's no evidence on the chart at all, but based on this testimony by
Right.
Corey Lane.
And when you say there's no evidence in the chart at all, there's no evidence in the medical chart that a physician assistant or a doctor came back into the examining room after the nurse left and said, I'm going to tell the doctor of the complaint.
Objection.
Well,
Object.
You
yeah,
can't
there's no
use part of
timing.
the hypothetical from testimony and then
Yeah.
put the other half of the hypothetical for when there is no testimony.
Okay.
That's unfair.
Yeah, we don't have a timeline.
Is there anything in the chart? Right, we don't have a timeline, do we? As
Well,
to-
we don't know when Corey Lane, when this happened.
Right,
We
do
don't
you
know
have,
that.
are you able to figure out whether it happened close to the time he was discharged, closer to the time of triage? Were you able to get a time frame of that incident at all from everything that you read?
If you want to go through the testimony, Ken, you can. It's up to you.
Right, through this testimony. I don't believe I could tell a timeline based on that, but if you want me to look at it again,
Yeah,
I'd be.
I don't want you to do it by memory. If there's anything
Happy
in
to.
Corey Lane Tolson's testimony that allows you to get an estimate as to whether it was at the beginning or at discharge that this happened, then I want you to look at that.
Okay.
And take your time.
Mhm. No, I really can't tell based on Corey Lane's deposition, any type of a time frame.
Do you remember from reading Mr. Tolson's deposition testimony that after he informed the nurse that his foot was cold to the touch and he had no feeling, that shortly after she left, a gentleman came in and wheeled him out of the treatment room and then out of the hospital?
Objection. You're going to have to show her the testimony if that's what you want her
Did-
to understand.
If you have that recollection, fine. If not, then I'll point the testimony out for you.
Sure, I remember something about a gentleman, but you'd have to tell me
Page
exactly
183.
where.
Of
Once you
Mr.
get-
Tolson?
Yeah.
183.
Hold on, let me get to it too before you go there.
Okay.
What page are you looking at?
183.
Thank you. And just read all the pages around it to make sure you've got the context
Sure.
of his
Mhm.
testimony.
So it looks like around discharge. Okay.
So, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but it looks like from a timing perspective, we have Mr. Tolson informing the blonde lady who's there in his room that his foot was cold to the touch, he had no feeling. And then there was another gentleman that came in either right at that time or just right afterwards, and then wheeled him out of the hospital. Do I have that accurate?
I'm not sure that you do, because I don't know the timeline of when he told her and when this discharge happened. I don't know that we know the exact timing of that.
Do you know what time period expired between the time he told the nurse of the complaint and the time he was actually wheeled out of the hospital?
Objection to
There's a-
the hypothetical. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say, there's no evidence, there's no clear evidence of the timing.
But it's fair to say that you assumed that in this period of time, wherever it was, that either Mr. Tolson's physician assistant or doctor came in and reassessed his foot. Would that be true?
According to
Objection.
Corey Elaine's deposition.
Is that true?
According
just
to
answered.
Corey Elaine's deposition.
Okay. Now, would it be a breach of the standard of care for the nurse to discharge Mr. Tolson, to discharge him, if his foot at the time of discharge was cold to the touch and numb?
If he perceived it or she?
No. If, I'm saying that this is a fact, I want you to assume that at the time he was discharged, his foot was cold to the touch and numb. Would it be a breach of the standard of care for a discharge nurse to have discharged him at that time if his foot was actually cold to the touch and numb?
Objectively.
Yes. If
Right, so
that's-
you're saying
yeah.
that a health provider assessed the foot, compared the two, did a proper assessment, and then noticed that the foot was colder than the other foot.
Well, I just want you to assume.
Well,
that
I
at the
can't
time-
assume
yeah,
without,
But for a hypothetical, I want you to assume if at the time of the discharge, his foot was actually cold to the touch, objectively, and his foot was numb.
we don't have any evidence.
Instead of, I'm asking you to assume that these are the facts of this case, okay?
I'm
Because
assuming
according,
that these are hypothetical facts
well,
of the case.
it's from Mr. Tolson's testimony. We know he said his foot was cold to the touch and numb.
Objection.
And then-
That's
and then-
not what he said.
His perception, that wasn't objective findings.
Right, but we do have evidence from him that that's what he perceived to be the condition of his foot at the time he was wheeled out, correct?
His perception didn't change the entire emergency room stay from beginning to end. Nothing changed according to the family's deposition or Mr. Tolson's deposition, but there were repeated exams over time by different people that showed no objective problems with that foot. Circulation, color, feeling, temperature.
Getting back to my hypothetical, and because you're an expert, I get to ask you hypothetical questions.
Okay, all
This
right.
is
They
my-
have to have a
this is-
basis
they
in
do-
fact,
They
Roger.
do have a basis in fact. It's Mr. Tolson's own testimony. So let me ask the question, and I'll see if I can get an answer.
Okay.
I want you to assume that at the time Mr. Tolson was discharged from the hospital, his foot was, in fact, cold to the touch, and he had no feeling in his left foot. If those were the conditions of his foot at the time he was discharged, would it be a breach of the standard of care for the discharge nurse to have discharged him with that medical condition?
Objection to the hypothetical. There are things you have not clarified as to whether it was his subjective feeling or whether it was objective or whether it was objective by examinations by healthcare providers and whether it was objective by which specific healthcare providers. So you can ask him to restate the question for what you need, or you can answer the question providing the information that you need, or you can tell him that you can't answer the question, whatever you want to do.
I'll choose not to answer the question.
Did you understand my hypothetical question?
She's already
Yeah,
answered that
just
hypothetical.
please don't assist the witness. You already told her not to say anything.
I
So
did
did you
not.
understand my hypothetical question?
It is a hypothetical question,
Yes, ma'am, it is. And did you understand?
but it doesn't take into account everything you need for an assessment. You can't just say, this gentleman had a nurse or a physician assistant or somebody touch that foot, felt like it was cold. I mean, it has to be a very thorough exam.
Well,
That would have
but-
had to have been a new finding.
But ma'am, my hypothetical question was, and I'm going to ask it again because I didn't get an answer to it.
Yes, you
And
did.
if you don't want to answer it, if you don't want to answer it, you can tell me you don't want to answer that question.
Okay,
But my hypothetical question is this,
all right.
and I'll say it as clear as I can. If at the time Mr. Tolson was discharged from the hospital, his foot was in fact cold to the touch, and in fact he had no feeling in his foot, I want you to assume that's the medical condition of his foot at the time of discharge. Would it have been a breach of the standard of care for the nurse to approve his discharge at that time?
Objection, that absolutely, I'm advising you that there's no foundation for that question. You have now said that the nurse approves a discharge. There's absolutely no foundation. In fact, anything in evidence at all, whether it be by family members, Mr. Tolson, any nurse, any physician's assistant, or the medical record. There's no foundation for that question. That is an improper question all the way around. The question that you asked initially on this point, the witness has fully answered. Just because you didn't like the answer doesn't mean you get to say it over and over again with further misstatements.
I disagree with your whole statement. Ma'am, did you
Of course
understand
you
my
do.
hypothetical question?
Let me,
I mean, please, if you're going to advise the witness, she needs to go outside.
well, I can't advise the witness if she goes outside unless I go with her,
You
so you
can't
tell me
advi-
what you want me to do.
You can't advise the witness what to do or not to say. If you could have a speaking objection, ma'am, we'll ask you to step outside, so it's up to you.
Okay, well, this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to advise you, ma'am, that
No, you can't advise a witness
I'm not
whether to-
advising her how to answer.
Well,
I am
then
advising
you're not
her.
supposed to give her any advice. You can't. You can't give a witness advice. You can object to the question. You cannot give her advice on anything. So if you want to place your objection on the record, she needs to step outside.
This
As
is
simple
my
as that.
objection, and I can put it on the record, and I can do it in the witness's presence.
you can't
I'm not
object to that.
advising this witness in one way or another with respect
Speaking
to
of,
her answer.
speaking objections.
As long
the
as it doesn't
witness has-
suggest the answer.
Speaking
Right.
objections,
I am not
the witness,
suggesting an
I'm going to
answer
ask the
here.
witness to go outside if you're going to make a speaking objection.
Well, then, no, that doesn't work. Ms. Wygand,
Yes.
Mr. Gaston is permitted to ask you hypothetical questions. Mr. Gaston, however, has to ask hypothetical questions that are based on evidence in the case. You can answer hypothetical questions if you have sufficient facts that he has presented to you to answer. If you do not have sufficient facts that allow you to reach an opinion because it's an incomplete hypothetical, then you don't have to answer that question. In fact, because you can't answer that question, okay? So if you need more information, if you need clarity to the question as to what he's meaning, then you should ask for that, or you should tell him that you're unable to answer the question if that is the case. Do you understand
I do.
the perspectives of how this works? Okay. So ask your question.
Do you remember my hypothetical? It's been the same for the last 4 questions.
Go ahead.
And the other
All right,
thing
let
is,
me-
you don't
let me-
have to answer the same question.
Right.
Ad
Note
nauseam.
it down.
You haven't answered
You've
it
done
yet.
it 2 or 3 times.
no,
You
you
don't
haven't.
need to, there's a point in time when you can ask the lawyer to please move on.
You haven't asked my last question. My hypothetical is based upon Mr. Tolson's testimony that his foot was cold to the touch and he had no feeling in his foot. And then shortly after he made that complaint, he was then wheeled out of the hospital, okay? Now, I want you to assume, we're going to assume again, that the condition of his foot at the time of discharge is what Mr. Tolson testified that it was. It was cold to the touch, and he had no feeling in his foot. Was it a breach of the standard of care for a nurse to have approved his discharge if his foot was cold to the touch and he had no feeling in his foot at the time he was discharged?
Objection. Incomplete hypothetical. Assumes testimony by Mr. Tolson that is not in evidence, and it is a misrepresentation of the scope of nursing.
Go ahead.
So lack of foundation and form. Go ahead, if you can.
I don't know that I can, because in his testimony, he never changed the testimony throughout. So you made some comment about shortly after he told the nurse, then he was discharged. I don't know if that was the case, because I don't think we know the timeline. And he was very consistent in his testimony. This wasn't a new finding on discharge. This was the same, you know, if he had this coolness to his feet, and if he perceived that it was numb, according to his testimony, that stayed the same the whole emergency room visit. He was assessed several times by several people. So if there was nothing found over time, it just doesn't make sense that, the question doesn't really make sense to me.
Now, assume, as you say, your hypothetical, his foot was cold the whole time he's in the hospital.
He felt
had,
that.
And he had no feeling. If that was in fact the condition of his foot at the time he was discharged, was it a breach of standard of care to discharge him at that time?
Objection. You've answered it 100 times
Yeah,
now.
I have. I can't keep answering the same thing.
Okay. Yeah. Which nurse discharged Mr. Tolson from the hospital?
Ms. Steele, Ms. Tell.
What was her obligation and duty under the standard of care to Mr. Tolson at the time she approved his discharge from the hospital?
Objection.
At the time she approved his discharge from the hospital?
I don't think a
Objection.
nurse approves a discharge. A physician makes a decision, or a physician assistant makes a decision about discharge.
Okay, so when the nurse signs a discharge report, okay, what was her obligation when she signed the discharge report?
Can you tell me what you mean by the report, Rodney?
Yeah. Do you know who, first off, do you know who actually signed? And we'll go to the medical chart, and I have it marked as exhibit number 3, and I'll hand it to you in a second. It's page 31.
What's that, Rodney? Discharge?
It's patient instruction
Okay.
page.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
Do you know which nurse signed this page?
I probably couldn't tell you whose signature without knowing the signature.
Is that a A-W there?
Objection.
Or do you know?
I'm not sure.
Objection.
I'm not an expert at signatures, so
Okay.
I can't.
All right. Whoever signed this discharge page, patient instruction signature, what was that nurse's obligation under the standard of care to Mr. Tolson?
Okay, objection. There's nothing, you have laid no foundation that this page imposes an obligation on a nurse. You haven't even identified what this page is or what the purpose of this page is. So you are completely misrepresenting this record to this witness. This is about the 100th time you've done it during the course of this deposition so far.
Ma'am, the nurse that signed page number 31 and exhibit number 3, did that nurse have any obligation under the standard of care when she signed that page to Mr. Tolson?
Read the page, ma'am, before you answer.
Read the page.
And if you
Yes.
can't answer, then you can tell them.
Looking just at this piece of paper, this is, it's talking about the patient instruction signature page, so that the nurse gave the patient instructions for discharge. And this would probably relate back to the sprain document that was sent home with the patient. So stating that the patient had discharge instructions.
Okay, and what, if any, obligation under the standard of care that that nurse who signed that page have to Mr. Tolson? You explained what the document was, and I need to know if that nurse was under a duty, under the applicable standard of care, to do anything for Mr. Tolson when she signed that page.
Objection. Do you understand what he's asking you?
I mean, when a nurse would sign a discharge instruction sheet, it's that he or she gave the instructions to the patient.
Okay.
And review the instructions, which,
And there's more to it.
and they understand that's right. Gotcha. Yeah.
Keep-
And do you know from reading Nurse Stell's deposition testimony or from the record what, if anything, she did or conveyed to Mr. Tolson at the time he was discharged?
According to her deposition, it doesn't recall him specifically, but she did talk about her routine standard that she does another assessment on the patient prior to discharge, so that she would have again assessed his extremity, checked his pain. She's got some documentation here in the record. But she talked about her routine, about looking at the limb again and going through and doing another assessment, making sure nothing has changed and everything is okay, and then going over the discharge instructions. And according to what she signed here, again, making sure that he understands them. I believe there was some information given about following up with an orthopedic doctor, coming back if there was any issues or if anything got worse. And
If you
then,
want to look at the discharge documentation too in
Yeah.
the chart, you can.
So
It's
on the
page 10
record,
in our-
right, on medical record 10, correct. She charted the time at 17:25. She charted Mr. Tolson's pain level as 0 on a 0 to 10 scale. Looks like he went out in a wheelchair. He was going to go home. Had some instructions about home care. I guess it looks like the patient family were there as well. He needed a certificate, I guess, for work, a sick certificate. He had prescriptions. I think one was for pain, maybe 2 were for pain. Talked to him about follow-up on what was needed, his instructions, any questions about medications. And she charted educational information. Looks like the IV was discontinued, and she put a dressing on. She does say yes, that he verbalized understanding. She did sign her name here. And so I think another nurse had her initials on the bottom.
Was she required to reassess his foot at that time?
She said in her deposition that that was her standard for doing so.
Did the standard of care require her to do that?
That would be, I mean, if it had just happened,
Under what circuit?
No, did the standard of care at the time that she wrote this discharge report, which is on page 10, require her to reassess his foot at that time?
that would be common that a nurse would do a quick reassessment, yes. And she said it in her deposition that that is what her standard of practice is.
Okay, and part of the reassessment is to
Same thing, pain,
pain,
sensation,
temperature,
color, temperature,
pulses.
movement, pulses, feeling, yes. She would have documented if there was any difference.
Was there any requirement for her to document what the pulses were in the chart when she reassessed him at the time he was discharged?
Not unless there was a change, no, because they did charting by exception.
Can you tell me the opinions that you've reached in this case with respect to the triage nurse?
What specific questions do you have?
Well, do you have any opinions one way or the other as to whether or not the triage nurse, Nurse Craddock, breached or did not breach the standard of care when she triaged Mr. Tolson?
I didn't see any problem with the triage.
What I'm trying to know is, do you intend to come to court and give an opinion, one way or the other, whether Nurse Craddock did or did not breach the standard of care when she triaged Mr. Tolson?
I am going to ask her that question.
I'm
If
asking her
Nurse
that.
Craddock complied with the standard of care in the manner in which she conducted triage on Mr. Tolson.
You want me to answer that?
Yes.
Yes, she did.
Okay, that's your opinion. What is the basis for your opinion?
Patient came in by ambulance. Patient was assessed by the triage nurse. I go to her page.
Go to her page.
Yeah.
Page 5. It's under tab 4 for
Yeah,
someone.
yes. Right, so he came in by stretcher by the ambulance. She assessed him, asked him his chief concern, or what they have recorded here as chief complaint. She said leg trauma at work. Stated he came in by stretcher from work. He was alert. No problem with his level of consciousness. No allergies, denied. She probably did looks like she did a quick systems check because she denied any issues with anything else, just to make sure there wasn't any other multi-system organ issues. She documented, she checked the leg, said that there was a positive deformity, stated that he unable to move left foot, had positive pedal pulses, did say he had pain in that left leg. She rated it a 7 to 10 on the scale of 0 to 10. Identified that he wasn't at risk for falls, hadn't had a recent fall. Felt safe in his environment, did an environment check. I'm not sure what that one, are you in relation, which you've been physically, oh, yeah, so that was like an abuse check. Did vital signs are fine, got his weight, signed her name, noted that there was a splint on his leg, and then she gave him a level and recommended that he go to the urgent care side of the emergency department. I don't see anything that's a problem in looking at the documentation and anything that she said in her deposition that was a problem. So I feel she met the standard of care.
When a patient comes into an emergency room hospital by ambulance with some type of traumatic injury to the extremity, does the standard of care require the triage nurse to ask the patient, how'd you injure your leg?
Objection to the form.
No, I think the standard of care is that the nurse finds out what the main issue is for the patient, what the patient's main complaint is, or what the patient's main concern is, but not really to look at like specifics and details about the injury itself.
How does the nurse obtain that from the patient if the nurse doesn't ask, can you tell me how you injured your leg?
Well, the nurse wouldn't probably even ask, tell me how you injured your leg. The nurse would say, why are you here today? She probably got a little bit of an update perhaps from the ambulance crew, and then she asked the patient, why are you here today?
And according to her note, do you know what Mr. Tolson told her why he was there today?
No, just according to her note, she has leg trauma at work.
Did the standard of care require her to write in the report what Mr. Tolson told her when she asked him the question, why are you there today?
Not necessarily, no.
In this case, did it require that?
Not necessarily, no.
Why not?
She just is doing a quick assessment as to what's his concern, what's the problem, is this life-threatening, and maybe some assessment as to what services he might need, what interventions he might need.
Is she also supposed to determine whether or not his injury is limb-threatening?
Objection. Beyond the scope, you can answer.
She did an assessment of his limb.
Did the standard of care require her to determine whether or not the injury to his leg could potentially be limb-threatening?
That's not in her scope, no. She's assessing him to look at right now, here and there.
Okay, so she assesses whether or not he has a life-threatening injury, but not a limb-threatening injury. Is that your
Well, she
opinion?
assessed his limb. She assessed movement, she assessed color, she assessed temperature, she assessed pulses, so she did her nursing assessment.
But I mean, in your opinion, is the triage nurse is required to determine whether or not the patient has a life-threatening injury? Is the triage nurse also required to determine whether a patient has a limb-threatening injury at the time of triage?
No.
Objection, asked and answered.
Her responsibility is to assess the extremity where the injury was,
Okay,
or is.
okay. Did her responsibility require her to note where on the extremity the deformity was?
Not necessarily. She's a quick assessment, because it's pretty busy in the ear.
So even though he had a deformity, it's your opinion she didn't have to write whether the deformity was on the ankle, the shin, the knee, or the thigh. Is that your opinion?
Yes, that is my opinion.
Okay. Is the triage nurse supposed to write the character of the deformity, the nature of the deformity?
Not necessarily, no.
Okay. Doesn't the nature of the deformity and the character of the deformity, isn't the information that can be gained from describing that could be determinative of the triage level that's assigned to the patient?
I don't even understand your question.
Okay. Have you ever triaged a patient in an emergency room?
I haven't worked in an ED in a while, and triage was not something I did that often, no.
So is it you've never triaged a patient in the emergency room that you can remember?
A long time ago, long time ago,
Okay, how many years ago?
like in the early 80s,
Early 80s? What ER room did you work at?
Fairview Hospital in Cleveland, Ohio,
And how long were you working at Fairview Hospital?
81, 82.
Did you always work in the ER at that hospital?
No, I rotated ER, recovery room, trauma ICU,
So-
CCU.
Is that the only time you worked in an emergency room in your nursing career?
I precepted students in the ED, and I precepted paramedics in the ED.
What I mean is actually physically worked.
Physically worked,
in
yes,
the emergency
81,
room.
82, correct.
81, 82. Is that the only time in your career that you physically worked in an emergency room?
Yes. Mhm.
Okay. And can you tell me between 81 and 82, of the other units you worked in, how many days a month you would work in the emergency room?
I can't, probably 25% of the time, it kind of ended up being about equal between the 4 units.
And of the 25% of the time, of that time, do you know what percentage was it as a triage nurse?
Yeah, very few. So I would never say that I'm an expert in triage per se, but I have experience with triage, and we teach our trauma ED nurses triage, but not currently.
Do you currently hold yourself out as an expert in the field of nursing practice for triage?
No.
Okay. Okay. Do you hold yourself out as an expert in the field of nursing practice for nurses who performed focus assessment on patients in emergency rooms?
No, I see myself as an expert at nursing practice in the critical care environment. But I don't think anyone would ever say they were an expert in focused assessment.
Okay.
But in nursing assessment, absolutely.
With respect to this case, do you hold yourself as an expert in the field of nursing assessments for nurses who work in the emergency room?
I see myself as an expert in nursing care. I've had over 30 years of experience, almost 35, and the experience as a nurse in assessing patients isn't any different regardless of setting. All of my practice has been critical care, step down, and care of acutely and critically ill individuals. So I'm definitely a nursing expert and definitely an assessment.
Okay. So your opinion is that the standard of care for nurses who do assessments is the same whether or not the assessment's done in an emergency room setting or in a non-emergency room setting. Would that be a fair statement?
The assessment of a patient is not all that different now, based on setting.
Okay.
We have pretty sick people everywhere, and we have limb changes everywhere, and we have a lot of circulation issues. I mean, the general principles of assessment do not change.
Okay. Do you know whether or not, I'm sorry, in the time that you worked in the ER from 81 to 82, are you able to tell me what type of forms nurses or nurses such as yourself used?
Type of what?
The type of forms that nurses such as yourself used to perform patient assessments in the ER setting?
Objection, relevance, form, foundation.
Do I answer?
It's up to you.
I mean, there's always a form. There's always a documentation form. I mean, we're computerized now, most of us, but there's always some type of a paper form
Okay.
back in those days. But even now, I guess this hospital still uses paper, but most people use electronic.
If a form is available for a nurse to use to do an assessment, do you have an opinion one way or the other, whether the standard of care requires the nurse to use the form or not?
I'm going to object to the extent that you have now asked a question generally about forms for nurses generally. If you want to ask questions specific to this case, that's fine. If this is a question that's dealing, you don't know where he's asking. So if he's asking about general things about forms, then I don't think you need to answer those. If he's asking
Can't
questions
tell
with
her
respect to
whether
this
you
case,
think she
you
should
can.
answer or not. It's improper. You keep
Rodney.
doing it, and it's improper.
All I want you to do, all I'm asking you to do is be fair to this expert.
I am fair. You just
All
don't
I'm
like the way I'm asking my
asking you to do is
questions.
ask questions that are pertinent to this lawsuit. And all I'm asking you to do is to ask questions that are based in evidence and that you don't misstate the evidence as a predicate to your question. If you would do those things, we would have no problems.
Ma'am, I'm going to ask you some other questions. For a nurse who performs an assessment of a patient in the emergency room, do you have an opinion one way or the other whether the nurse has to note the findings of her assessment in the medical chart pursuant to the standard of care?
Objection to lack of time frame, lack of location, no scope, no definition to the question, so no form or foundation.
You can answer.
I can answer.
If
Yeah.
you're able to,
She's-
ma'am.
In this specific situation, the nurse, there is an initial assessment, and then if there's charting by exception, then there's no additional charting unless there's a change from initial assessment. So if a form exists, that doesn't necessarily need, a form has to be completed. The form's only completed if there is a change that needs to be documented.
Okay, you said a lot of things there. I want to try
Okay.
to understand your question.
Sure.
So for the initial assessment that a nurse does, if there's a form in the hospital for the initial assessment, is it your opinion that the nurse should use that form to document her assessment?
Objection.
Every hospital policy is probably slightly different, but as long as the assessment is documented, that's the key.
Okay. And we know that Nurse Stell performed an initial assessment, correct?
Yes.
Okay. Can you tell me where in the chart she documented the findings of her initial assessment?
I believe she said in her deposition, there weren't changes, I don't believe. She's got, like her IV, she has some of her interventions that she did, but I don't think she charted any additional assessment findings because there weren't any differences, there weren't any changes.
I'm talking about her initial assessment of Mr. Tolson. When she initially assessed him, do you know where that appears in the chart?
Asked and answered.
Right. She said if there was a change, she would have documented it, but it's not, there wasn't a change from the triage nurse documentation, so there's no additional documentation. I think in her deposition, she scratched through this because she said there weren't any changes.
So in this case, would it be fair to say that there's no documentation in the chart of Ms. Stell's actual assessment of Mr. Tolson?
An assessment only needs to be documented if there are changes to the original assessment.
Right. And my question again is, in this case, we have no documentation in the chart of Ms. Stell's initial assessment of Mr. Tolson. Would that be a fair statement?
We have documentation of some things she did, but there was not another form filled out.
Okay. And some of the things she did, were they the findings of the initial assessment, or were they just some things that she did for Mr. Tolson?
They were some of her nursing interventions.
Okay. But not the initial assessment?
It doesn't sound like it needed to be because there wasn't a change. If you're charting by exception, you don't need another assessment
Right.
document.
And there's nothing in the chart that indicates what her actual assessment was, correct?
She said in her deposition, I don't see additional assessment charted, and she said in her deposition that what her standard was, what her standard for doing so was, and if there were any changes that she would have documented.
Because I didn't see anywhere in the chart that she documented her initial assessment, what the assessment was.
And she
Would you
didn't
agree
need
with-
to if there wasn't a change from the triage.
But do you agree that it's not in the chart?
I don't see another assessment, but there also wasn't the need for another assessment.
Okay. Now, and that's because your opinion is that there wasn't a need for her to document her assessment because in accordance with her testimony, there was nothing in her assessment of Mr. Tolson that differed from the assessment performed by the triage nurse. Would that be a fair statement?
Objection.
Well, my assessment also would be, or my opinion also would be, that if there was a change, it would be documented. And then the physician assistant had her assessment, which was not all that different either than the initial assessment.
So let me understand your opinion again. Your opinion in this case is that Ms. Stell, Nurse Stell, according with her testimony, did not find anything different in her assessment than from what the triage nurse did. And in your opinion, because that's what she said in her deposition, that she did not have to write her assessment in the chart.
That's part of it, and I also would assume, looking at the chart, there wasn't a change, or I would have seen the change documented.
Okay. So you did not see any change
Correct.
in Mr. Okay, let me finish the
No,
question.
sorry.
That's okay.
That's all right. He did not see any change in the assessment of Mr. Tolson that was done by the physician's assistant that
He
differed
does-
from the
or, I'm
Let me
triage?
get the whole question out.
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Is this a new question, Rodney? Because that
Yeah,
is completely
it-
different than the last one.
No, it's a new question. I
Okay.
couldn't get it out because you,
I'm sorry.
that's okay.
Sorry.
It's all right. At the end of the last question, you said you wouldn't expect to see an assessment because there was no change in condition noted in the chart. Do I have that correct?
That's correct. If there was a change, it would be documented. Correct.
Okay. And the reason you believe there's no change is because the assessment that was done by the physician's assistant was the same as the triage nurse?
Objection. Misstates the testimony.
Yeah, no, I might have confused the issue. No, I'm
Okay.
just telling you, looking at a medical record, there was the assessment by the triage nurse. There's no repeat assessment documented by Ms. Stell. My assumption is, looking at this, is that if there is no assessment documented, that means there was no change. And then I kind of added this addition. There is another follow-up by the physician assistant and a very thorough assessment as well.
Was there any different in the anything that changed from the physician's assistant's evaluation of Mr. Tolson and the triage nurse assessment?
Take your time and look at it.
Yeah, so the triage nurse said that he wasn't able to move the foot, and the physician assistant has limited range of motion. He also has, or she also, I think it was a woman, she also has kind of marked on the leg. I don't know what these circles exactly are. She does say left knee, positive swelling, tender on palpation. Positive pulses, left leg, and I'm not sure what that says now. Maybe left leg and ankle, perhaps, positive tender, palpation. So, I mean, there's a little bit more detail here, I think, during the physician assistant's assessment. The only striking thing, or the thing that stands out to me, is that there is some movement. So the patient, Mr. Tolson, was able to move his leg when the physician assistant did an assessment.
When Nurse Stell did her assessment of Mr. Tolson after he was triaged, did the standard of care require her to ask him, how'd you injure your leg?
Objection.
Part of conversation may have been she already knew that he hurt his leg. She may have said what happened, but it just would have been getting more information, perhaps, just in establishing a relationship with the patient and talking. But she's not doing anything in more detail than that because it's just,
No, my
it's
question,
not going to change a lot of what then she would do, so.
my question's very specific.
Okay.
When Ms. Stell did her initial assessment of Mr. Tolson,
Mm-hmm.
was one of the questions she was required to ask him under the standard of care, was it, how'd you injure your leg?
Not necessarily, no.
Okay.
She
In this
might
ca-
say, tell me why you came today. It would be same as chief complaint or chief concern.
Was she required to understand the mechanism of his injury?
No.
Okay. Why not?
That's not what nurses do. It's not within our scope.
So in your opinion, nurses are not required to make an inquiry of the patient as to the mechanism of their injury when they do an assessment of a patient in an emergency room?
Correct.
Was Nurse Stell's obligation under standard of care to determine from her assessment whether he had a life-threatening or limb-threatening injury?
Her, as a nurse, she would do an assessment of the patient and just identify if there are any red flags or any major problems.
My question is, under the standard of care, when Nurse Stell did her initial assessment of Mr. Tolson, was she required to determine whether or not he had a life-threatening or limb-threatening injury at that time?
Well, I think nurses are always assessing, so it's something that we're always doing.
Is
But
Is that a yes?
Listen to the question.
I'm sorry.
He's
Is-
asking you if it's the standard of care for her
Right.
to make a
Pardon me.
specific determination as to life-threatening or limb
No, the triage nurse kind of determines, where the patient maybe best goes. And then the nurse is going to kind of do another assessment of the patient and see what his current status is.
So your opinion in this case, the standard of care did not require Nurse Stell, when she assessed Mr. Tolson, to determine whether or not he had a life-threatening or limb-threatening injury.
Objection, foundation, scope.
It's not something that I think we think about, as nurses. We're there to assess if there's any changes, and if there are any changes, to notify a physician or physician assistant.
So in your opinion, Nurse Stell did not have to make a determination when she assessed Mr. Tolson whether he had a life-threatening or limb-threatening injury. Is that your opinion?
Objection to form, scope, asked and
Yeah,
answered.
it's just not within that. It's not something we do as nurses.
Okay, thank you. Now, the nurses order x-rays.
Not all nurses. It
But
depends
Ms.
on the hospital policy. In this specific situation, it sounds like the nurse ordered some basic x-rays.
And in order for a nurse to order an x-ray, then the assessment that the nurse performed would require a suspicion of a fracture.
Objection.
Would that be true?
Not necessarily. There was an injury. He came in with left leg injury, and she made the decision to get the x-rays of that left leg.
Was Nurse Stell required to consider whether Mr. Tolson had a fracture when she assessed him?
Objection, again, scope.
No.
No? Was she required to determine whether or not Mr. Tolson suffered from a dislocation to his knee when she assessed him?
No.
Was Nurse Stell required to perform a physical assessment of Mr. Tolson's leg?
She'll perform a nursing assessment of his leg.
And what did the standard of care require of Ms. Stell when she performed a nursing assessment of Mr. Tolson's left leg?
So it would be the same as the initial triage assessment. So looking at the leg from top to bottom, looking at temperature, feeling, asking about sensation, seeing if he can touch the same on each side, checking on movement, can he wiggle toes, can he move the foot, color, temperature.
How about pulses?
Oh, definitely.
Okay. And what pulses was Nurse Stell supposed to evaluate on Mr. Tolson's left leg in accordance with the standard of nursing care?
So the standard would be to check either the pedal pulse or the tibial pulse in both feet and compare them.
Is this by palpation or by some other device?
Palpation.
You said check with the movement of the toes and movement of the foot.
Typically, I'll just ask, can you move? Can you move your leg?
Was she required to do a range of motion testing on Mr. Tolson's leg?
No,
Why not?
because he just had injured it, so you can't really do anything until you really know what's going on with that leg.
After he was x-rayed and the x-ray revealed there was no fracture, was she required to reassess his leg at that time with a range of motion testing?
No, it's not.
Why?
It's not nursing scope. It's not within our scope.
Well, it's not within the scope of nursing to assess a person's leg after an x-ray was taken to show no fracture when she didn't do the range of motion testing before?
No.
Objection.
So is the nursing assessment, and you correct me if I'm wrong, that Ms. Stell was required to perform on Mr. Tolson similar or the same as the nursing assessment that the triage nurse was supposed to perform on Mr. Tolson?
Yeah, she would do an overall assessment, make sure there's nothing, perhaps that the triage nurse might have met or not have done. And then she would have really focused on the injury. She would have focused on his leg, unless he gave her any additional information that would have seen out of the normal or abnormal.
And how does the nurse palpate for pedal pulses? What part of the body does the nurse have to touch?
Pedal pulse is top of the foot.
On the foot itself, the top
Yep.
part? Okay. If a patient has a splint on their foot and the nurse is unable to access the top of the foot to do a pedal pulse, is the nurse required to take the splint off, or are they supposed to leave it on?
Nurse doesn't
Objection,
take
lack of
this.
foundation. Go ahead.
Yeah, the splint doesn't come off, but usually a splint isn't on the top of a foot with a leg injury. Usually the foot's free. Both feet it would be free.
Was she required to check the pulses of the popliteal artery?
No,
Why not?
because you always go to the distal. You always go the furthest. If you have distal pulses, then you're going to have the pulses further up. If you don't have distal pulses, then you'll start coming up.
Okay. Do we know when the splint was taken off of Mr. Tolson's leg?
The one that was put on by the paramedics?
Yes, ma'am.
No.
Do we know who took the splint off of his leg?
I don't think we do.
Should that have been noted in the chart?
What's that?
Who took the splint off his leg and when it was taken off his leg?
Not necessarily. I mean, I can make an assumption that that splint perhaps came off when the new immobilizer was put on, perhaps by the physician assistant, but that's only an assumption. It's only a guess.
But your opinion in this case is that there was no requirement of the nurses to note in the chart when the splint was removed from his
No.
leg or who removed it from
I mean,
his
if the
leg?
nurse removed it, she might document I removed the splint, but
But there's no requirement, in your opinion, under standard of care
No.
for that to be noted in the chart?
no.
Okay, all right. And is the basis of your opinion that Nurse Stell didn't breach the standard of care in her assessment of Mr. Tolson based upon her deposition testimony?
It's based upon the medical record and deposition.
Okay, but there's nothing in the medical chart that indicates what her assessment of Mr. Tolson was, correct?
Well, we go by charting by exception, so if there is nothing charted, then there was nothing changed.
Okay. So if you didn't have her deposition testimony, would your opinion be the same based upon the chart alone?
It probably would be, because all I need to know is, did they follow charting by exception? And it's what we all do now. It's what we do in practice. Back in the olden days, we didn't, but now it's all charting by exception.
Is a change in the patient's level of pain a change in condition that should be reported in the medical chart if a nurse appreciates that?
Objection. Go ahead.
So if somebody is given, if an intervention is done for pain, it's expected then that you reevaluate. Did the intervention work or not work?
And how often is the nurse required to be evaluated after the pain intervention is applied to the patient?
Yeah, I don't know if there's a standard set for that and it changes, but usually within an hour to two. There's kind of like a range. There may be a certain policy, like you should check within 30 minutes or something like that, but usually there's a little more lax now that you can at least check within an hour to 2 hours.
Is it within 1 or 2 or do?
There's not a strict guideline at all. It's just that the standard is that there is a reassessment. And if you look at different books, they might all give you a slightly different answer on that.
So in your opinion, as long as they reassess?
As long as it's reassessed within a reasonable period of time.
And your reasonable period of time is a 2-hour window.
Personally, an hour would be nice. But again, there's no strict guideline on that.
Ron, you going to something else? Don't take a break, I don't.
You can take a break if you'd like.
I'd like to.
Sure, absolutely.
Okay.
Go right ahead.
Does that mean we're all technical?
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, I wasn't here for part of it.
Sir, 2:27 PM going off the record. 2:29 PM back on the record. Conclude disc number 1 in the deposition of Deborah Wiegand. 2:29 PM going off the record.